I inherited my grandfather's house about 2 years ago. It sits on a spacious 2-acre lot at the edge of our subdivision, backing up to a nature preserve. The property was actually here long before the subdivision was built around it in the 1990s. According to my grandfather, the developers had tried to buy his land multiple times, but he refused to sell the homestead where he'd raised his family. Eventually, they built around him, and through some complicated zoning arrangement, his property was grandfathered into the new subdivision with special exemptions. When I moved in after his passing, I was vaguely aware that the property was part of a homeowners association, but I'd also inherited a file folder labeled HOA exemptions that detailed all the ways my property was different from the others in the neighborhood. My grandfather had been meticulous about documentation, thank goodness. The trouble began last spring when I decided to expand the vegetable garden into a proper small-scale farm. I'd recently left my corporate job to pursue my passion for sustainable agriculture, and my grandfather's property was perfect for it. I planted rows of heirloom vegetables, installed a modest greenhouse, added 6 chickens for fresh eggs, and set up 3 beehives at the far edge of the property to help with pollination. Everything was well within the boundaries of my land and, more importantly, within my legal rights according to both local ordinances and my grandfather's negotiated exemptions. For the first few months, things were peaceful. Several neighbors became regular customers for my fresh eggs and vegetables. The elderly couple next door, the Johnsons, were particularly supportive, often bringing me homemade lemonade while I worked in the garden and taking fresh produce in return. Mrs. Johnson even joined me for a beekeeping workshop I hosted for the neighborhood kids. Then Patricia Montgomery moved into the large house across the street. Within a week, she'd been elected to the HOA board. Within a month, she was the president. And within 6 weeks of her arrival, I received my first violation notice. Unsightly agricultural activities visible from street. Commercial farming prohibited in residential zones. Remove all non-ornamental plants, structures, and livestock within 7 days. I was baffled. My garden wasn't visible from the street. You had to walk halfway up my long driveway to see anything beyond my house. Plus, I had documented exemptions. I decided to handle this reasonably and attended the next HOA meeting to clarify the situation. That was my first encounter with Patricia in person. She was in her early 50s with an expensive blonde bob and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She ran the meeting with the precision of a military operation, cutting off anyone who spoke for more than her allotted 2 minutes. When my turn came to address the board, I explained my situation calmly. My property has documented exemptions from standard HOA landscaping and land use restrictions. These were negotiated when the subdivision was built and have been honored by the board for over 25 years. Patricia's smile tightened. Mr. Reed, we're all aware of your grandfather's arrangements. However, the board has reviewed those documents and determined they don't extend to commercial farming operations. I'm not running a commercial farm, I explained. I'm growing food for personal consumption and sharing with neighbors through a small community segmented agriculture arrangement, which is explicitly permitted under both county regulations and my exemptions. Selling produce constitutes commercial activity, she countered. Additionally, livestock is expressly prohibited in our covenants, with no exemptions noted. I pulled out my documentation. Actually, Section 4 of my exemption specifically states that traditional agricultural activities, including the keeping of small livestock traditional to the property's historical use, are permitted. A murmur ran through the room. Clearly, most of the residents hadn't seen these documents before. Patricia's face flushed slightly as she glanced at the other board members. "We'll need to review these documents further," she said dismissively. "In the meantime, please refrain from expanding your hobby." I left the meeting feeling uneasy. Something told me this wasn't going to be resolved easily. The next morning I was collecting eggs when I noticed Patricia standing at the edge of my property, taking photos with her phone. When she saw me watching, she didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. She just gave a little wave and continued documenting my violations. 2 days later, I received another notice, this one claiming my beehives posed an imminent danger to the community and needed to be removed immediately. This was followed by complaints about my chicken coop being an unauthorized structure and my greenhouse violating height restrictions. I responded to each notice with copies of my exemptions and relevant local ordinances, but the violations kept coming. It was clear this had become personal for Patricia. Things escalated when I hosted a small farmers market on my property one Saturday. I'd invited a few other local growers to join me, and about 30 neighbors came through to purchase fresh produce and honey. It was a lovely community event, until Patricia showed up with 2 other board members. "This is a clear violation of zoning regulations," she announced loudly, disrupting a conversation I was having with a young family interested in beekeeping. "Commercial events are prohibited in residential areas." "Actually," I replied calmly, "this is a private gathering of neighbors which is permitted. I've checked with the county." "We'll see about that," she snapped, pulling out her phone and walking away. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled into my driveway. Officer Martinez was someone I knew. He'd bought tomato plants from me earlier in the season. He looked uncomfortable as he approached. "Thomas?" He nodded. "Got a complaint about an illegal commercial operation and potential public health hazards?" I sighed. "Let me guess, honeybees and free-range eggs?" He tried not to smile. "Something like that. Mind if I take a look around, just so I can say I did?" I gave him a tour, showing him my permits for the beehives and documentation for the chickens. He nodded, completely unsurprised. "Everything looks in order to me," he said, raising his voice slightly as Patricia hovered nearby. "You might want to check with the county about the right permits for community gatherings, but there's no violation happening here today that concerns the police department." Patricia was livid. "Those animals are a health hazard, the noise and odor are affecting property values, and those beehives are dangerous. What about children with allergies?" Officer Martinez turned to her. "Ma'am, 6 chickens don't constitute a health hazard when properly maintained, which these are. As for the bees, they're a permitted agricultural activity in this county, even in residential zones, due to their environmental benefits. If you have specific complaints about noise or odors, you can file a report with County Health Services." She glared at him. "I will be filing a complaint with your supervisor about your failure to enforce the law." Officer Martinez remained professional, but I could see a flicker of annoyance cross his face. "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. Now, unless there's an actual emergency, I need to get back to patrol." After he left, the market quickly wrapped up. The confrontation had cast a pall over the friendly atmosphere. Patricia stood by her car, still taking photos and making notes, making sure everyone saw her documenting their attendance. The following week, I received a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer threatening legal action if I didn't immediately cease all unauthorized agricultural activities. I took the letter to my own attorney, who assured me my position was solid, but warned that legal battles with HOAs could be lengthy and expensive regardless of merit. That night I was awakened at 2 a.m. by bright lights shining into my bedroom window. I looked out to see a county animal control van in my driveway and 2 officers approaching my chicken coop. I threw on clothes and ran outside. "Can I help you?" I called. One of the officers turned. "Sir, we received an emergency call about loose livestock causing property damage and posing a threat to residents." I was confused. "All my animals are secured. The chickens are locked in their coop for the night, and bees don't exactly wander around in the dark." We walked to the chicken coop together, where they could plainly see that all 6 hens were securely contained and sleeping peacefully. The officers looked as confused as I felt. "Someone called this in as an emergency?" I asked. "At 2 in the morning?" The older officer sighed. "We've been getting a lot of calls about this property lately, always from the same person, always described as urgent. This is the 3rd call this week, but the first time we've been dispatched overnight. I had a pretty good idea who was behind this. Let me guess, Patricia Montgomery?" He didn't confirm or deny, but his expression told me everything. "Sir, everything looks in order here. Sorry for the disturbance." As they were leaving, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows across the street. Patricia, in a bathrobe, watching the scene unfold. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. She wanted me to know it was her. The next day I installed security cameras around my property. It was becoming clear that this had escalated beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Over the next few weeks, I documented no fewer than 12 drive-by inspections by Patricia, 3 more visits from animal control, 2 from the health department, and another police call, this time claiming I was operating an illegal farmer's market again, when in reality, I was just having a birthday barbecue with friends. Each investigation found no violations, but the constant harassment was taking its toll. Some neighbors began avoiding me, not wanting to get caught in Patricia's crosshairs. Others expressed support privately but were afraid to do so publicly. The Johnsons next door were the exception, steadfastly bringing their lemonade and defending me to anyone who would listen. "She's done this before," Mrs. Johnson told me one afternoon. In her last neighborhood, she drove out a family who dared to paint their front door red instead of the approved forest green. "She's a bully who uses rules as weapons." I was beginning to think I might have to give up my small farm, or even sell my grandfather's property, when an unexpected ally emerged. Caroline Chen was a quiet woman who lived at the other end of the subdivision. I knew her only vaguely from neighborhood gatherings. She showed up at my door one evening with a proposal. "I'm a reporter for the county newspaper," she explained. "I've been hearing about what's happening with your farm and I'd like to do a story on it. Not just your situation, but the larger issue of sustainable local food systems and how they clash with suburban regulations." I was hesitant. "I'm not looking to escalate this into a public battle." Caroline nodded. "I understand, but this isn't just about you. I've been researching similar cases across the county. There's a growing movement of suburban homeowners wanting to grow food sustainably, and they're facing outdated regulations and HOA restrictions. Your case could help others." I agreed to the interview, and a week later Caroline's article appeared on the front page of the local section, "Growing Conflict: Sustainable Farming Meets Suburban Rules." The piece was thoughtful and balanced, presenting both the case for small-scale urban agriculture and the concerns of those who opposed it. It included quotes from local environmental groups, county officials, and several of my supportive neighbors. Patricia was quoted as well, insisting that rules exist for a reason and that property values must be protected from unsightly agricultural experiments. The article caught the attention of a local TV station, which sent a reporter to do a feature on my small farm. The segment showed my immaculate garden beds, the happy chickens in their artistic coop, and the beehives safely situated away from common areas. It contrasted these images with Patricia's claims about unsanitary conditions and dangerous livestock roaming the neighborhood. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Neighbors who had stayed silent started stopping by to express support. Several brought their children to learn about the bees and chickens. My Saturday produce stand, which I had temporarily suspended, resumed with greater attendance than before. But Patricia wasn't backing down. If anything, the publicity made her more determined. The violation notices continued, now focusing on technicalities like the height of my garden fence and the color of my greenhouse. She began recording anyone who visited my property and taking down license plate numbers. The turning point came through an unexpected channel. Remember those beehives I mentioned? I'd been maintaining detailed records of their health and honey production as part of a state university's citizen science project on pollinator populations. Dr. Eleanor Hammond, the entomologist overseeing the project, had been receiving my data for months but had never visited in person. That changed after she saw the TV segment. She contacted me to arrange a site visit, explaining that my beehives were showing unusually successful pollination patterns that could be valuable to her research on declining bee population. Dr. Hammond arrived on a Saturday morning, coincidentally during my busiest produce stand hours. She was investigating my hives when Patricia made her usual appearance, this time with a county zoning inspector in tow. "This property is in violation of multiple county ordinances," Patricia announced loudly to anyone who would listen. "The inspector is here to document the violations before legal proceedings begin." The inspector, a tired-looking man named Dave, nodded uncomfortably. "Just doing a routine check, ma'am." Dr. Hammond straightened up from the beehive she was examining, her university ID badge visible on her lanyard. "Excuse me, are you with the county environmental department?" Patricia jumped in before the inspector could answer. "This is a zoning matter, not environmental. Your beekeeping hobby is about to be shut down, Mr. Reed." Dr. Hammond raised an eyebrow. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Hammond, head of pollinator research at the State University. These hives are part of an important state-funded research project on sustainable pollination in urban environments." She turned to the inspector. "Are you aware that interfering with approved research projects can trigger a state-level review of county enforcement actions?" The inspector looked from Dr. Hammond to Patricia, clearly reassessing the situation. "I wasn't informed about any research project." Dr. Hammond pulled out her tablet and brought up official-looking documentation. "The project is registered with the State Agricultural Department. Mr. Reed's property is one of our most valuable research sites because of its unique position between suburban and natural areas." Patricia tried to regain control. "Research or not, this property is violating HOA covenants that supersede any state project." Dr. Hammond smiled thinly. "Actually, state law is quite clear that agricultural research projects have certain protections from local restrictions, including HOA covenants. I'd be happy to connect you with the university's legal department to clarify." The inspector was already backing toward his vehicle. "I think I need to consult with my supervisor before proceeding. Ms. Montgomery, I'll be in touch once I've reviewed all applicable regulations." Patricia was fuming. "This is ridiculous. He's running a farm in a residential neighborhood. He's contributing to essential research on pollinator conservation," Dr. Hammond corrected. "Research that could help save our food systems as we know them. But please, continue explaining how your concerns about property values outweigh environmental science." Several neighbors had gathered to watch the exchange, and I noticed Mrs. Johnson recording everything on her phone. Patricia must have noticed too, because she abruptly turned and stormed back to her house. After the inspector left, Dr. Hammond explained that while my beehives were indeed part of her research program, she had perhaps overstated their significance and the legal protections they afforded. "But she doesn't need to know that," she added with a wink. "Sometimes people like that need to encounter someone they can't intimidate." That evening, video of the confrontation was circulating in the neighborhood's social media group. Residents who had previously stayed out of the conflict began commenting, many expressing frustration with Patricia's crusade against my farm. The next HOA meeting had record attendance. Patricia tried to keep the agenda focused on routine matters, but during the public comment period, nearly a dozen residents stood up to speak in support of my farm and against what one person called the board's harassment campaign. Mrs. Johnson presented a petition signed by over 60% of the neighborhood households asking for a special review of recent board actions and calling for new guidelines on sustainable gardening practices. Another neighbor, an environmental lawyer, questioned whether the board's targeting of my property might constitute selective enforcement, which could expose the HOA to legal liability. Patricia tried repeatedly to cut off the discussion, citing time limits and agenda rules, but for once, she couldn't control the room. Even other board members began distancing themselves from her position. "I think we need to reconsider our approach to this matter," said Robert Livingston, the board treasurer. "The last thing we want is a lawsuit that would drain our reserves. Perhaps we should consult with our attorney about a reasonable compromise." Patricia glared at him. "We can't let one resident ignore the rules everyone else follows. It sets a dangerous precedent." "The precedent was set 25 years ago, when the exemptions were granted," I pointed out. "I'm simply exercising rights that came with my property." The meeting ended with the board agreeing to form a committee to review the situation and recommend a resolution. Patricia was notably excluded from the committee, which would be led by Robert and include 3 other residents, including Mrs. Johnson. As we were leaving, Caroline Chen approached me with a smile. "Interesting development. Mind commenting for my follow-up article?" I gave her a brief statement about hoping for a reasonable resolution that respected both my property rights and the community's legitimate interests. As we talked, I noticed Patricia nearby, apparently waiting to speak with Caroline. After I walked away, I circled back and overheard their conversation from just around the corner. "This is completely one-sided reporting," Patricia was saying angrily. "You're portraying me as some kind of villain when I'm simply protecting the neighborhood's values and appearance." "I've quoted you accurately in every article," Caroline replied calmly. "Well, you should know that Reed's farm isn't as perfect as he pretends." Patricia lowered her voice. "I have evidence that he's violating water restrictions with his excessive garden. The county will be very interested in that during a drought year." Caroline's voice remained professional. "That's a serious allegation. What evidence do you have?" "I've documented his watering schedule for weeks," Patricia said smugly. "He waters daily, sometimes twice daily, far exceeding permitted usage. I have date-stamped photos." "I see," Caroline said. "And how did you obtain these photos? From the public street?" Patricia hesitated. "I have documentation. That's all you need to know." But I knew exactly how she had those photos. She'd been trespassing on my property. My security cameras had caught her several times snooping around early in the morning or at dusk, but I'd never confronted her about it, choosing instead to document the intrusions. The next day, I provided Caroline with video evidence of Patricia's repeated trespassing. I also explained my water conservation system, which collected rainwater in underground cisterns for garden irrigation, meaning I rarely used municipal water for my garden at all. Caroline's follow-up article was devastating. HOA president alleged to trespass repeatedly on neighbor's property. The piece carefully presented the facts without making accusations, but the security camera stills showing Patricia prowling around my property told their own story. The article also highlighted my water conservation methods as a model of sustainable gardening during drought conditions. The response was immediate. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, which Patricia notably did not attend. Robert Livingston presided instead, announcing that Patricia had taken a leave of absence from her duties, while the board investigated the allegations. 2 days later, Patricia put her house on the market. A week after that, she resigned from the board entirely. I later heard from Mrs. Johnson that Patricia's real estate business had suffered after clients saw the articles about her behavior. Apparently, potential homebuyers were hesitant to work with an agent who had become infamous for neighborhood disputes. The new HOA board, now led by Robert, worked with me to create clear guidelines for sustainable gardening and small-scale urban agriculture in the neighborhood. Rather than fighting against my farm, they embraced it as a community asset. We established a neighborhood community garden on a vacant lot owned by the HOA, using my expertise to help residents grow their own food. The county zoning department, intrigued by our neighborhood's approach, used our guidelines as a model for updating their own regulations on urban agriculture. Dr. Hammond's University expanded their research project to include several more properties in our subdivision, turning our neighborhood into a case study for suburban pollinator conservation. Patricia's house sold quickly, and she moved to a gated community in another county. I heard she specifically chose a neighborhood known for its strict HOA enforcement, hopefully not to lead it, but rather to feel protected by it. As for me, my small farm continues to thrive. Last month, we hosted our first annual Willow Creek Harvest Festival, with neighbors contributing dishes made from locally grown produce. The event was featured in Caroline's newspaper and even received coverage from a statewide agriculture publication. Mrs. Johnson, now serving on the HOA board herself, often reminds me how close we came to losing something valuable. Some people are so focused on protecting what they have that they can't see the benefits of growing something new, she says. I think about that whenever I'm tending my grandfather's land. He held on to this property because he valued its history and potential. Thanks to an unexpected battle with an HOA Karen and the community that ultimately rallied around us, that potential is now being realized in ways even he might not have imagined. Yesterday, I installed a new sign at the entrance to my driveway. It reads, "Reed Family Heritage Farm, growing community since 1946. Below that, in smaller letters, proudly exempted from standard HOA regulations since 1997. It's a small reminder that sometimes standing your ground can lead to positive change that extends far beyond your own backyard, even when that backyard contains chickens, beehives, and a community that finally found its voice.